Welcome to my talk on questionnaires and structured data capture with examples. I'm Brian Postlethwaite from Microsoft Research. So I'm a senior software engineer over at Microsoft Research. Started up there just recently, having moved from Telstra Health. And I'm a HL7 International Patient Admin Co-Chair, FMG member, and of more relevance is the contributor to the .NET FHIR SDK and Facade project. And for this topic, I've been implementing SDC since probably way back in 2014. So I've been doing it for a long time. And the reason I'm not there in person is I got a great case of COVID a little over a week ago, week and a half. So if I go on mute, it's probably for me coughing, and I'll apologise in advance. So what we're going to cover today is understanding the basics of FHIR questionnaires and understanding how SDC extends that functionality, and then talk about how we can validate a questionnaire response against questionnaires and what tooling and projects are out there, and really what's changing in R5. And then hopefully people will pop questions into the chat if they want to ask stuff. And otherwise I've got plenty of examples and stuff that we'll be having a good look at. So before I dive in, sort of just a bit of a workflow of where do questionnaires fit into the scheme of things. Excuse me. So we start off and we need to locate a questionnaire for us to use. We're not going to cover that today, but it's really around we need to find it for a given context. Then once we load that questionnaire in, we need to render it with any referenced content. And during that process, we might pre-populate some data. So pull some information out of the EHR record or some other context and pre-fill the questionnaire before the user starts entering that data. We've got some local validations that might happen during that data entry. And then once we're all done, we can do validations against the server where we go and do the final check to get any errors, warnings and issues that we can show the user. And then we're going to save that back to the server for a final submission. And that might be extracted into other resources. So that's really the scheme of where do questionnaires fit into the bigger picture. So from the FHIR artifacts, so we've got several core resources. The actual questionnaire resource, which is the definitional resource. So it defines what does this questionnaire look like. So what are the questions in it? What are the rules that are applying to it? And it's kind of similar to a structure definition is to other resources, and we can apply structure definitions on resources to add validation rules. Similarly, that's what we get in the questionnaire. They might include value sets and terminologies as well. And then we've got the questionnaire response, which is the actual data that's been entered in against the definition. So the definition and the captured data are two separate resources, and the structure of those two things have to match. So we have to make sure that we've got the appropriate questions and answers referencing each other. So we do have extensions, operations, profiles, and implementation guides, which is SDC. And note, we don't typically profile questionnaire. So one thing we've seen in the past is people start pulling out Forge or their favourite profiling tool and start trying to profile and slice up questionnaire resources to create their new form. Well, that's not the whole point. The whole point of the questionnaire resource is to be that definition. So you might create a profile on questionnaire if you wanted to say, all the questionnaires associated with this particular thing, such as social determinants of health, will have this specific baseline. So they must have this particular set of coding, or they'll pull a code out of that particular terminology, and all link IDs must be present. So those types of things. So it's not going in and saying, these are the questions. That's the point of the questionnaire. And so we can see that there's that relationship between the questionnaire response to the subject, which is a patient, but it could also be for other things. It doesn't have to just be for patients. And then the questionnaire points back to the questionnaire and then through to the value set if they exist. So I'm going to just do a touch on what is the structured data capture. So it's a set of extensions on the core definitions and provides capacity for advanced rendering, form behaviors, adaptive forms, importing data into forms, and extracting data out of forms. And every other time I've done versions of this presentation, it's been the SDC guide is about to be published, it's about to be published. Well, I'm happy to say that it's finally been published in March, so we're a little bit in now, and it's been going great. And so that's the link to where it is. And so we've got our form filler, which is the component that the user interacts with to go and enter the data. There's a form manager, which is about managing the definitions. So if I want to go and design new questionnaires and save them, then that's the role of the form manager. If I'm submitting forms, that's into the form receivers, and response managers are sort of closely tied with that particular capacity. And then archiver when you go in and pull that content out. But for the rest of this talk, I'm going to assume that this is a whole of structured data capture and the base specification as a complete set, rather than trying to say what is in one and what is in the other, because it doesn't really matter. So we've got, this is all of the different types of questions that we can have. So these are the different answer types. I'm not going to go through all of them because that will take us the rest of the day, but I'll sort of point out that we've got groups for creating collections of answers. We've got display items for any labels, so we can put labels anywhere in a particular questionnaire. And then we've got things like date, time, and time. So we've got separate capacities. And I've got string and text, where I can have string being a short free text, whereas text is a longer, think multi-line text boxes with carriage returns. And then we've got choice and open choice, which are coded data. The difference being open choice could be from a list, or it could be typing a string, which is just some other content. And so some of the things like the choice, you can provide a different, through an extension to say, instead of rendering this choice as a drop-down, we want to have it as radio buttons or an autocomplete, depending on what type of data we've got. So I'll just skip forward again. And so as we sort of touched on there with the choice type, so choices are really what we interact with the terminologies. So in that, we've got item types of choice and open choice. And we connect that particular type of question up to the value set through an answer value set, or we can have answer options with value coding. And of course, we can have repetitions. So if you wanted to have a multi-choice checkboxes, then we don't have multiple items for each of the possible choices. We just create the one item in the questionnaire. We'd say it's bound to this value set, which has got my 4 values, or alternatively list the 4 values in it, and then say this is a repeat so that they can be all included. And then we can choose from a control selection. Say I want this to be radio buttons, combo boxes, check boxes, or autocomplete. So that's really around the design preference for the designer of the form. They might choose that there's only 5 values here, or there's 3 values. Radio buttons is perfectly fine, and so I can define yes, select that. Or there might be 100 values. So radio buttons are going to be probably not the best idea, but a combo box might be right at the edge. But let's say you've gone over and you've got 100 1,000 or 80,000 entries, then you're not going to want to use either of those or any of those. You want to use an autocomplete, which is where you start typing in and then it starts pulling in results, pulling that content in, which is what that consideration is. With the reference, so that's a canonical reference. So it goes out to an answer value set. It could also be to a contained value set. So you can put a value set inside your questionnaire and reference that with an pre-expanded. And I might do that if I've got the same small set that's been used in 20 different questions. They're all saying yes, no, maybe, or often, frequently, rarely, and never. And I've got the series of that. And so it's a way of sharing a set of values to put in. And why would I have it embedded rather than referenced? Embedded if it's never used anywhere else, and I don't really care about it. But if I do want to use it across questionnaires, then it would be better off resolving it externally. And so the item control extension is for the control selection. We've got an option exclusive to tell us if we've got a multi-select option, if they select this particular item, don't allow any others to get there. We've got preferred terminology server. That allows us to define on either an individual question, a group, or the entire form that it needs to talk to this specific terminology service, because it might have a specific set of terminologies in it. It might have a terminology which is not a true terminology, but it's a facade into some other system. And so that's a technique that we can use there. And it uses the expand operation from the value set to use those terminologies. So before I jump down towards where I'm doing examples, I thought it was a good point that we should look at versioning. And so when we've got a specific questionnaire over time, so we might do a yearly update on a specific form definition. And so those are not FHIR versions. So we can see there's a number down here. These are the instance versions. There's a canonical version. And so if I can look at this, so each of those rows is a FHIR resource. And so it's got a different ID. So it's the resource ID. They all have this same canonical ID. And then, so there's their version number, canonical version number, and this is the instance number. So I can see from this definition that my original one, I did 4 iterations on that particular one before I decided actually that's fine and moved over to 0.1. I did 5 iterations on that, did a little bit of testing, and then retired that one and had a 0.2. And so there was 4 iterations on that one. And then we've ended up with our current one, which I probably should have a version number on for 0.4. But I've been hammering this one and that's now active. And so we can see that is the definition. So when I go and reference this questionnaire response back to its definition, I include the questionnaire URL, which is this field. And so I grab that, and then I've got this vertical bar 02 to say I'm actually referencing this response was done against this specific version or canonical version of that form definition. So we can have multiple versions of the same definition. So I think years is a good example for that. And then we really would want to have only one version active. And we do have available from and available till as extensions so that you can define, say, okay, this particular version will become active at the 1st of July and the current one will no longer be available at that point. So that's one reason why you might have 2 active, but with a non-overlapping time period. So that's kind of cool. So I'm not going to dive into FHIR path expressions too much, but one of the questions that I often get is, we've got our own engine, we do this, and we've had to use JavaScript to go and dive in and create all this extra functionality. And to meet those needs, we've got FHIR path expressions, which allow us to do custom validations. We can define pre-populations and initial values. So pre-population coming from an existing bit of data, or just using a default initial values. We can use variables and calculated fields. I'll go and show some examples of those shortly, where we can do calculations for the likes of a BMI or a score and get calculated. Enable when gives us the capacity to dynamically hide and show fields. So while the user is entering content, and actually get a real dynamic experience. There's an extension for enable when expression, which is that as well. And then answer expression is for those, instead of answer option, where you've got a couple of codes, you can do answer expression, which can give you some calculated versions of those things. And the STC guide has that definition there. So now let's jump into some actual sample forms. So we've got a bit of everything is our first one. So what we've got here is, so this is a renderer, so a form filler, and this is rendering a bit of everything, where we've got a string, a text, a boolean, a date, time, so all of those individual fields. But we'll note this particular renderer doesn't support quantities at the moment, but it has a set of options. We have a set of values that were pulled through from a value set. We've got a drop down, which is very similar to that, and we've got autocomplete, countries, so EUS, so we can see that comes through. We can see AUS, and we can see that. And so that's the real experience. And so when I look at that and go, well, what was the real difference between those two? So I've done a save, and it said, well, this one's fine because it was an open choice, so I can have a free text in there. Whereas this one is not fine because you haven't selected an answer, and it's an autocomplete, but it's a choice option, so you must pick one from that set. So what does this definition actually look like? So for that, I'm going to grab another tool. So this is another tool I've got, which will allow us to go and have a look. So this is the bit of everything form. So if we can look up the top, I can see it's HTTPS bit of everything. That's the ID of this particular form. So if I look here on the publishing, I can see this is the bit of everything. It's version 19. And so there are no other canonicals. We've got each of those different fields with a group and type, but because we want to actually see the raw content, so this is the actual JSON that's being rendered. So we can see in there, we've got a terminology server that's been defined to say, use this specific one. We've got a use context to say, hey, this is one of my demonstration forms. And then we've got our group, which is a bit of everything. And then we've got our type of display, which is the label at the top. So there's our display label. We get our string. And then we've got a text, Boolean, integers. And so we'll notice here that we've got a decimal that's got a extension for the unit to show we want to see a meters. So that's where we get our meters shown at the side. And we've got our extensions for our attachment to say we want a maximum, we only want PDFs, or JSON, or images, or PNG. So we've got a handful of different types that we're accepting to continue through. So that's kind of cool. So that was really a nice part. So I will step on to groups. Actually, I'll step on to, so this is our test application, which has the group. So I'll look at a larger questionnaire. Actually, we'll just look at the languages. So when we looked at our terminology, live demonstrations, so there's several ways of associating it. So this is a locally defined set of options, just to put 3 options in. This is a contained value set with an included expansion. And so it just renders those in. This is a versionless canonical reference to languages, so that pulls in. This is a version-specific reference to bring that content in. And this is a preferred terminology server from another service. And that's from another service again. So we can see that there's lots of different capacities, and then that's a direct version. So there's quite a few different options, and if I go and look at the actual definition for that one, coding sampler. So we go back to our coding sampler, selecting language in various ways, that raw JSON. We'll see there's our contained value set with some options in it. We also have that's it. And so if I look at our specific question, interestingly enough, here is the local text, and we've got a markdown extension to say, hey, draw this with a bold or underline, whatever it is. And so here's our options that are included in line. And then we can have our no terminology server. And we just said, here's a value set that's been pre-expanded, which was up the top. Or we can have our item control telling us render with a drop-down. And our item control with a drop-down. And so here's a version-specific reference. And so when I look at our reference to our value set, it's saying, look at the languages, but the version 302, just like we had with our canonical references, to see that. So that's kind of cool as well. And then if I want to pull the content straight from a particular preferred server, in this case, Onto server. So we've got our extension to say, use this terminology server, CSIRO, and read the languages from it. So even though I've been grabbing the same values, set of values, I've been pulling them from different places in different ways. And so that's a really good demonstration to go through from that. So now we'll go to enable when. So I've got some enable when tests. So this is that capacity.
Brian?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but is it possible if you zoom in a bit on the...
Yep. Will do.
Little more, I guess. Okay, thank you.
No worries. Okay,
yes, so that's okay. Thank you.
Perfect. No worries. So the enable when gives us the capacity to change the values, and then those will then add and remove content as that data is changed. So if I look at that and say 4, 5, and so I can see that there's that capacity to have that type of thing. So 6, and there's that content with dates. I'll put a value in. 2020. Wrong way. So you can see there's some property comes in and goes away, so as there's different content. And you can see the same sort of thing with other fields. So we can do it with multiple choice in ABC. So you can see this particular field is visible when B is there, and this one is visible only when B and C is selected. So which is kind of cool. So you can do that. Works with that. And yeah. And there's also, yeah, so there's less than, so 7. So you can do it based on other fields as well. So that's enable when. So last 2, I'll do the Abbey Payne scale. So this is each of these questions has a weighting. And so when I go and click it and say this mild value, so I've got 0, 1, 2, and 3 are the weights on them. So as I go and click through, it'll actually score that out. And so each of those weights gets added, and we come down to our 9. And then they then reflect down further in and into our final value. And so you can see, you can get that sort of really complex evaluation. So what does that look like on the inside? So let's have a look at that actual definition. So we can see here we've got our values. Excuse me. And interestingly enough, we can see each of these options has been repeated. So this was migrated from another system. And so looking at that, I would have suggested that this one should have a reference to a contained value set that had, because it's all the same. And so I really could have that defined once at the top and then just reference it. And so I can look at this configuration. So the weighted values is where the link ID is in those set. And then we want to get the answers ordinal value. And then the dynamic calculation is that we have a weighted value, which is the aggregate of all of those values. So we've used a variable to hold on to all of those values. So we've got those as just a set of numbers in weighted values. And then we want to see, here's the aggregate value, and then provide that as a choice. So this is the choice calculation to go and evaluate that. Now, interestingly, there is a debug mode on this particular one. Expression, let me just, you can't see what's going on here. Where is it? Debug expression, styles, display it, and then make that go away. So now I can see here that this variable weighted values, as I go and change values, you can see that each of those values is the weighted value that's coming in. And so that's showing that, yes, we're updating that variable correctly. And then this calculated field is grabbing the aggregate of all of that, which is 1 in this case. So you can see as it works up, you can get that. And then there's the evaluation of that final calculated field to do that. So that's a really powerful capacity to have in the SDC bag. And a validation of the question based on today. Let's go back and see. Actually, I'm going to skip that and we'll come back if we get some more time. So that dynamic behavior, as we were seeing it enable when. So that's through this backbone element on the item called enable when. And we can have it, whether it exists, if you're using an exists on a question, then you use an answer boolean. So you don't have, there's no not exists here, because we'd say enable when question 1 exists, answer false. And so that's how we do a not exists. So there's no not operator, but we do have equals and not equals so that you can have that capacity. So when I had those multiple radio buttons, multiple checkboxes where I had to say A or B, and I wanted to have two conditions to say if both of these are checked, then enable this other field. So that was where we then use an equals with a coding, and then this enable behavior can be any or all. And in that case, it would have been all, because you want to have the A value and the B value to give that capacity. If you want it to be any more complex than, say, I want it A or B and C, and so combinations, if you want to do that, that's when you go and use the enable when expression mode. So the tooling portion. So there's a bit of tooling out there now. So from a coding perspective, so we've got on NPM, so I've created a package for SDC helpers, so that really all of those extensions, so I added capacity for each of those. If I go and look at that code, which is here. Here. So this is the SDC helpers. So if you're in the TypeScript platform, so that's what that code was doing in the background. So you can actually say structured data option. So I've got an item, which has got a link ID, and you can say set hidden, and that'll set the value. So it knows internally in that helper method what the extension URL is for hidden. So you can go and work with that. And then you've got the get capacity, so get hidden, and you can see there that I've got in my sample, there's a hidden true, and you just go get hidden, and away it comes back. And then you've also got the options for clearing extensions to go and remove that particular one. So we've got access to the URL if you want it. So that's a really handy set of utilities. So that's there. That uses the FHIR extension helpers, which is a set of TypeScript libraries for just interrogating extensions without having to go and map or filter through the IDs looking for the right string. It does all that internally. And that, yes, use the types FHIR. So if you went to Gino's session just prior to this one, so there's a new project going on around creating another TypeScript class set to help manipulate. So we'll work with that with Gino to help get that. And those expressions, so there's a FHIR path engine which does those evaluations, and that's a really good tool. The validator, so in the .NET space, I've got the gist there for doing those validations. I might jump into that a little bit later, not that we've got a lot of time, but I will show the FHIR path tester. So once you get into doing FHIR path expressions, you'll go, I need that. And maybe I just click on the link. Yes, I know it. So which is this site. And so that's where I can actually go and run any specific expression. And of course, because I've been waiting, I'll come back to that too. And so from a renderer's perspective, so there are open source renderers out there. So the US National Library of Medicine, so Paul Lynch has the L forms, LHC forms. There's a handful on GitHub, and just recently, in fact, about 4 hours ago, so Health Norge, so the Norwegian Health, Kenneth Myra has just published their implementation, which is a React implementation. So that's now open source, and there's some commercial products out there. I'm working on one which is in the background, hasn't moved forward, but there are a handful of others that are floating out there. And there's a link there to go and find any others that you want as well. Builders, so the National Library of Medicine has one. The other approach I see is actually convert from non-FHIR definitions. So if you've got existing systems that do surveys, do a conversion. I did at my previous job conversions from 4 different systems into the FHIR questionnaire definition, and rarely came up with a feature that SDC and FHIR didn't already cover. So it's a very rich capacity. Graham's got a capacity. That Forms Lab, which you saw, was that one, which I've been working on. It's still very much in progress, but you can see it's kind of neat. And there's beta software, and there's the Norwegian Health or text editors. So that's all very good. So what's changing in R5? So disabled display has been added, so hidden or protected. So when you're doing an enable when, you can see that the demonstrations I was having was just hiding them. But this capacity will give you the capacity to either hide them or just disable them, so you get that flexibility. Answer constraint is being added, where you can have options only, or options or type, or options or string, and open choice is being changed to just coding. And then to replicate the open choice style, you just say it's a coding, and you add an answer constraint, options or string. Item control, there's a few additions getting added to that. And so what are we doing with structured data capture outside of R5? So there's translations are being added. So we've got a write-up that's coming on how to do that, and that will be a really good addition. The other item that I'd suggest people go and have a look at was doing modular forms. So there's a capacity in structured data capture for that. And then eventually when R5 gets released, we'll do a version of that. So validation, we get the capacity to define a whole lot of different layers. Really, each of those layers is, we want to make sure the serialization layer is fine, a profile level validation is fine, and then we want to go through the questionnaire response, making sure the item types match, the terminologies are fine, required fields are filled in, repeating sections are under the groups that they're meant to be under, any based questionnaires through derived reference that's done, and all of that validation surfaces back to the user through an operation outcome resource. And so when I look through here, these top 2 are really system level, so that you rarely expect that to fail. As I go through this set, it's increasing in terms of these ones. The first one shouldn't expect, so it'd be a system failure if that was going wrong, but required fields and stuff. So pay attention to what sort of, if you're producing a server, that those messages are appropriate to display to users. So unlike profiles, it's more a system-based validation, whereas the questionnaire validations are really targeted at an end user that's actually entering in data. So make your error messages really good and information. And the location is inside the issue, so you can actually match up a message into a control. That's a gist, which is my implementations, or the first cut of that. And here's an example of an outcome saying this mandatory field severity is missing. And so the severity just happens to be the title of a specific field. And so that's a message that will be shown to the user, and it's actually against that item or that answer in the questionnaire response. And this next one says this is a passed only. So that's the coded version. So from internals, we know what that is. and it's saying this field cannot be a future date. And the answer to so this diagnostics is telling us that it was evaluating this expression when it tried to do that. It was an invariant, and it's on this specific question. So that's correct. So I'm going to leave that there. So I think we've come really good on time. So reach me. I'm in the speakers gallery. That's my email address on chat on Zulip, my personal blog. Some of my other Microsoft colleagues have got sessions coming up, and I've got a FHIR one tomorrow for those that are there. Note the grade one's out. You can't go to and see and ask questions now, but you can go back and look at the videos and ask there. So with that, I'll put to questions. So that gives us 5 minutes of question time.
Thank you, Brian. First, I will see if there's any questions here in the room. Yes, there is.
Hi, so I was stalking your GitHub account while you were speaking, and I was wondering if the Form Lab stuff is going to be open source.
The Forms Lab, there will be parts of it will be. The FHIR Lab, which you saw very briefly, that is open source. So they're closely related, you might have gathered. But yeah, so it was a Christmas project for myself, just to go and learn Vue.js and try out those new libraries. But yeah, so it's going to stay there. I will enhance it over time. And parts of it will become open source. I haven't decided whether the whole thing does or not. Cool.
Hi, I'm trying to explain FHIR questionnaires to a non-technical person or a group of non-technical people and product managers, doctors, and so forth. Is there a good, like, canonical use case or place that it's actually I can demo, like FHIR questionnaires in action that says, oh, yes, I want something like this, that really shows it off well? Has it been implemented somewhere that really works well? Thank you.
Like basically anywhere that you're doing a data entry. So you've got forms that are filled in, so assessment forms, surveys, all of those places that you typically see. That's where it's really heavily done. But yeah, not sure what more to add there. If you're looking for a system where if you just want to go and try out stuff, so that I can throw some links into those demo places that I was playing with, so you can go and try out form definitions and that. So that's a good capacity. I hope that's answered some question.
Okay, thank you. So there's also a couple of questions coming in Hoover. And the first one is, when would you use FHIR queries and when FHIR paths in expression-based populations?
So you got with the pre-population, I didn't cover that in today's talk, I've done that in the past. But you've got observations, FHIR path or structure map are your three choices. So if you're just pulling content out of observations, then that's the logical choice. The FHIR path based extraction is if you want to go and grab other content. So with that, you can define and say, hey, I want you to go and say, here's a bundle of a search bundle to say, go and get me this data. And so it might pull out the related persons because you want some of that, pull out some medications, and then you want to use those FHIR path expressions to read that data that you pulled out and then pre-fill into it. Say you were creating a referral that had what were the medications that you were taking. And so you can use that to pre-fill that little subsection, and then you could also go and add some others in. So if your system didn't have support for that query, you could still go and type it in. So that's where I would be doing that FHIR path.
Okay, so maybe one last question. That questionnaire versioning you are showing is a mechanism you are using, not part of the standard, correct?
No, it is 100%. That is exactly the versioning mechanism with FHIR. So there's 2 layers of versioning. So there's the regular instance versioning, and then all of the canonical metadata style resources, which Questionnaire is, there's that canonical version that goes along with it. So structure definitions, search parameters, observation definitions, value sets, code systems, they all have that canonical version that goes with it. So that was cool. So
okay, so there's
yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, and I'll just touch on, if that answers the question, I'll touch on the visual design of a questionnaire up to the app. Yes, and so what we're really providing with the SDC guide is, here are the hints, this is how we want you to do it, but it's really a guidance to say, if you want to say, well, we don't do it ever with checkboxes, we always do radio buttons, the rendering can do that, because you might be on a mobile device and then there's logical controls that make sense. But as long as you get the data out and it makes sense, then that's okay. Cool.
Okay, so thank you. There's more questions in Whova, but Brian will be able to answer them still after this session. So thank you for your attention, and thank you, Brian, for a very nice presentation.
No worries. Thank you very much. Glad I got some questions.